Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classic Lectures. We are now in lecture number 57 from volume number 7 of the Harvard Classics, and we will begin now with the Confessions of St. Augustine, written in Latin somewhere between Common Era 397 to 400, and the original title was actually Confessions in 13 books. Now, that's significant because in the Harvard Classics, only the first 10 books are published, but without any kind of mention that there's an additional number of books beyond it. I don't really have any idea why, and I haven't been able to find any reason why Dr. Eliot decided to do it this way. But we'll go ahead and just deal with all of the 13 books, however, giving our majority of our emphasis to the 10 books of the Harvard Classics. Now, if you haven't been following my other lectures, I very much recommend that you go and find LearnStrong.net, go down that left-hand side, find the Harvard Classics lectures, and at least watch a few of those if you want to get a sense of kind of the trajectory of where we've come from and then kind of where we're going, okay? Obviously, the first question, and it's been a question we've asked a number of times as we picked up these volumes, is why this text? So, for example, we asked this about Milton, we asked this about Francis Bacon, asked this about Burns, and now we'll ask it about this classic text, Confessions by, again, St. Augustine. I think there's a couple of answers to this. You can begin to take notes now and kind of you can follow this and my logic in this. I think it's an easy way, in Western thought especially, to draw a line from Plato to St. Augustine to Milton and then finally to T.S. Eliot, and more particularly to his Wasteland. And Eliot representing, I've given recently a series of comments on the Wasteland, where I comment on this as well there, that a whole lot of what makes T.S. Eliot's Wasteland an important text of the modern, and then of course today postmodern understanding, is our reading, his reading, and then our reading of Confessions. I think there's another way to think about it. Think about this. We mentioned Plato already. I've given lectures in the Harvard Classics series here already of lectures 5, 6, and 7. And then think about Marcus Aurelius in my lecture number 9 of the Harvard Classics, and Epictetus, my lecture number 8 of the Harvard Classics. All of that is going to give, I think, us a better understanding of how we read St. Augustine. And his mentioning of Cicero, we'll talk about that in the Harvard Classics lectures, volume number 9. And Plotinus, which we don't have in the Harvard Classics. However, we're going to have him mentioned in Confessions as the term Platonist, and we'll have more to say about that here in a while. Which then gives us an understanding of how to read Milton, and especially Paradise Lost. I've given a series of lectures on that already here, Harvard Classics lectures 13 through 34. And as well, our reading of Francis Bacon informs to a large degree our study of Confessions. I've commented on that with Harvard Classics lecture number 10. And then that leads us to our thinking about Franklin, Harvard Classics lecture number 2, Woolman, number 3, Harvard Classics lecture number 3, and then finally Penn, Harvard Classics number 4. What is the point I'm making? Simply this. And I think this is why it's so important that we engage in this study of St. Augustine's The Confessions. Augustine has been standing behind almost every one of the titles up to this point in the Harvard Classics. And I think that when Dr. Eliot made his selection, I think he was acutely aware that now in volume 7, he was going to give us finally the actual St. Augustine and his Confessions. Now, before we get into that, let's just review quickly our learning theory, that capacity to connect new information to old information. And the primary way we do that through our reading is to read at multiple levels. At level 1, we answer the question, what does the text say? At level 2, we answer the question, what does the text mean? Here we subdivide into 2A and 2B. Themes, messages, 2A, 2B, the rhetorical stuff, not what St. Augustine says, but how he says it. And then at level 3, we answer the question, how can I relate to this kind of information? At 3A, how can I relate this to other titles and to myself and the world? And then at level 3B, how can I relate this to myself in regards to how I have a personal understanding to it? Now, our approach will be, first of all, to provide some background information. Then we're going to give a general review and then work book by book throughout the text, and including, we'll go in and include books 11, 12, and 13, even though they're not in the volume. Now, this is important. We want to look at Augustine from three different perspectives. We played this game, for example, in our study of Emerson. We will play this game now in our study. We played the game with Milton. We'll now play the same game here. We're going to see Augustine from at least three different perspectives. Now, we're going to say this again in a second, but let's put it in our notes already. Technically, there's two Augustines, if you get my drift. There's the Augustine who's an older man who is writing the Confessions about what his life was like when he was younger, because the Confessions is autobiographic. Okay? Now that's important, especially for the first 9 books of this Confessions. There's a second, however, Augustine, and that is, you could say, Augustine the seeker, Augustine the pilgrim, Augustine the journeyer. I mean, think about our comments about Dante, right? There's two Dantes. There's Dante the writer and Dante the pilgrim, right? Who takes the journey through, those three places of Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradiso. Same game is in some ways being played here. There's kind of two Augustines. There's the Augustine doing the writing as an older man, and there's the Augustine about whom he's looking back and going, yeah, this was me as this kid, this was me as this adolescent, this was me as this young adult, etc., etc. But I want to look at Augustine from three different perspectives in a different understanding. One, I want us to think about Augustine as person. That is to say, his biography, no question. But I want to think about him, Augustine, as he thinks about the psychology, the individual mind, and sociology, his relationships with other people. Of course, his mother, no question, Monica's going to play big time in our conversation, but also his understanding of friends and friendship in and of itself. There have been scholars, and there are a lot of scholars who have studied on and spent their whole life studying just this volume. But a lot of scholars have pointed out you can actually plot the trajectory of Augustine by looking at his relationships with friends. So we'll want to pay attention to that. Number 2, we want to see Augustine as seeker, as discoverer, that is to say, as philosopher, and then as theologian. Now, the place we'll go to kind of study this is to take a look at the distinctions between two different schools of thinking. The school out of Athens is the school of philosophy. The school out of Jerusalem is the school of theology. And we want to ask how these two somehow interrelate, right? The tension and the collaboration between the two. Let's get out of the way right away. Sometimes students will say to me, I'm not interested in St. Augustine because I'm not interested in Christianity or being a Christian. No. You totally miss it. We don't study St. Augustine simply because we want to understand his theology. We study Augustine because he has tremendous amounts of things to say about philosophy as well. Okay. Finally, number 3, if we're seeing him as person, his approach to psychology, his approach to sociology, if we're seeing him as seeker, both as philosophy, that's the school of Athens, as well as theologian, school of Jerusalem. Because he's certainly, of course, the greatest of the church fathers. There's really no question about that, unless you want to include Aquinas in that debate, okay? For sure, the Christian theological world somehow spins between St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas in the same way that the Greek classical world of philosophy spins between the two poles of Plato and Aristotle. And it is significant that Plato had a far greater influence on Augustine than did Aristotle. And that Aristotle had a far greater influence on Thomas Aquinas than did Plato. And so it's fascinating to kind of study these two different pairs as they relate to the two different schools of Athens and Jerusalem. But number 3, we want to see Augustine also as a creator, an artist, a writer. And that's really important because he's writing an autobiography. And why is that important? Because before you can have Franklin's autobiography, you have to have the first legitimate, we kind of say, autobiography. And so for us as students of rhetoric, and Augustine was a teacher of rhetoric, and students of writing, we want to pay attention to this text as a text of autobiography. Now, his influence, no question, is prodigious, can't be overstated, and in many ways, I'm going to argue that the Confessions is kind of like a new Aeneid, a new epic poem. And that's no throwaway, because the Aeneid is in fact a very influential text when we get into our reading of the Confessions. Now, let's do a very brief biography, and one of the reasons why this is going to be a very brief biography is because, hello, we're doing the Confessions, which is an autobiographic piece, so a lot of this we're going to fill in as we go, okay? We call him, of course, St. Augustine of Hippo, a place of North Africa. He's born the 13th of November 354, and he dies the 28th of August 430 Common Era. He's born, as we said, in North Africa. Aurelius Augustinius is his name. His Christian mother is Monica. His non-Christian father, until much later in that man's life, who will convent later, is a significant part of his life, but not mentioned very often in the text. We'll get into more of that. He attends the University of Carthage. He's educated in rhetoric. He takes a lover. This shocks a lot of people. When for the very first time they pick up Confessions, they are stunned how much sex there is in this text. And Augustine is very open and honest about his relationships with at least 2 different mistresses that he took. The one that he was with for a number of years, and produces actually a son out of wedlock, because he never married, right? And we'll have much more to say about Deodatus here later, okay? He joins a group of kind of spiritual thinkers called the Manichees, and the Manichean heresy, as he will refer to it later, because he didn't last in that school of thought, is going to play a significant role in his life. He becomes a teacher of rhetoric at Carthage. He moves to Rome, then finally to Milan, and in 387, this is a pivotal moment. He will convert. He has a conversion experience in Book 8. Put this in your notes right now. Everything about Confessions is pointed towards Book 8 and the conversion, and then of course what happens after the conversion experience, okay? He is baptized. Of course, his mother Monica, who has been this kind of like helicopter mom, we may call her, but she's constantly in the life of St. Augustine, constantly praying that he will someday convert to Christianity, and ultimately he does in 387. In 395, he becomes the bishop of Hippo, and there, for the last 35 years of his life, is what he does. Because he becomes, without question, considered the most important theologian, right? Especially in terms of attacking heresies within the church and defeating those heresies. We're not going to have a lot to say about that, because there's not a lot to say about that from Confessions other than the Manichae heresies, okay? He writes 2 really important books. The Confessions is the one that we're talking about, from 397 to 400 Common Era. And the more important book for much of his theology is City of God. For example, when Mortimer Adler decided to publish his great book set, we mentioned him before in relationship, obviously, to the set that was published before the great books, the Harvard Classics. In the volume for Augustine, not only is there the complete all of the books of Confessions, but there's as well City of God. This text is really important. So if you're very interested in the study of St. Augustine, especially as theologian, you've got to take a look at this text called City of God. It is written after the fall of one of many falls of Rome in 410, published in 426. Now, these are just a few of the high points. We want to read and study now Confessions to fill in many of the gaps, as you can imagine. And again, as we've already said, these 2 Augustines will forever be kind of standing back behind any study of the Confessions. Well, how to approach the 13 books. I can't give individual lectures on each. I'm sorry, I just don't have the time to give to that. I wish that I could. And I'm going to focus primarily on the 10 books of Harvard Classics, but we will outline the other 3 just so that you have an exposure to all 13, right? We're going to summarize each book in order and focus, again, focusing on these 3 perspectives of Augustine as person, Augustine as seeker, and Augustine as artist. It was this church father, Tertullian, who asked the question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? That was a really important question because, of course, in the history of thought, you have Greek classical thought before you have Christian thought, right? And especially theology. And so there was a real debate about how much should a Christian know and care about writers like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, of course, and these philosophers? Because it seems like maybe the study of philosophy would take one away from their study of theology. St. Augustine is really influential for us because he will say no, and in fact he will argue in Confessions that he is happy, glad, that he first started with the philosophers and came to Christian theology. Okay? Now, can we read Confessions and not be a Christian or want to be a Christian or a practicing Christian in Christian theology? Absolutely we can. Can we read Confessions and not be a Catholic Christian? Absolutely we can. So as we look at the text, we want to pay attention to the ways, again, at those multiple levels, that Augustine is speaking to any number of readers, not just to believers. And certainly a postmodern student of this text has got to appreciate all of the influences of this text, even though sometimes we don't necessarily appreciate it. For example, psychology and Freud, that happens in the early part of the 20th century, in many ways can't happen without the Confessions. Well, let's go ahead and begin now, first of all, by talking about translation. There are a lot better translations now than the Edward Pusey translation that I'll be working with from the Harvard Classics. The Pusey translation is also the one that's used in the great books. One of the reasons why I think, though, this is an important translation is because of our study of other texts and writers who are very influenced by this translation. For example, when we study T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, "To Carthage then I came, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest burning." Those famous lines of the Wasteland at the conclusion of the third part of Wasteland, that fire sermon, as it's referred to. He's quoting directly from this translation of the Confessions. And so I think it's significant that we'll go ahead and look at this translation. Although, for those of you who are very serious about your study, please do note for yourself, there are other translations that do a much better job out of the Latin than our translation here. Although this translation is a great one, I love it, and I will enjoy reading from it. In fact, since I am going to read from it, I'll start right at the very beginning then, and I'll just read a set of opening lines just to get you kind of in the feel of the language. If I had my rathers, I would read every word of this translation, and as we went, we would exegete. I don't have the energy or the time to give to it. I apologize. But I will give you at least kind of an introductory set of comments that can help launch you into your own study. And again, that's my hope, is that you'll pick up your own copy of Confessions and read it for yourself. It's wonderful stuff. He begins, "Great art thou, O Lord, and greatly to be praised. Great is thy power, and thy wisdom infinite. And thee would men praise, man but a particle of thy creation, man that bears about him his mortality, the witness of his sin, the witness that thou resistest the proud, yet would man praise thee, he but a particle of thy creation. Thou awakenest us to delight in thy praise, for thou madest us for thyself, and our heart is restless until in repose in thee. Grant me, O Lord, to know and understand which is first, to call on thee or to praise thee. And again, to know thee or to call on thee. For who can call on thee, not knowing thee? For he that knoweth thee not may call on thee as other than thou art." Now, these opening lines already will introduce us to many of the major themes here. But the one that I want to focus on is Augustine as seeker. The entire Confessions is in really a prayer to God. But it's as if we are kind of like voyeurs looking in and listening in to this prayer. And right away, we're going to have the questions that he is going to ask right away. And again, it's questions for God. And this is, of course, important because St. Augustine does not shy away from questions. This will shock a number of you, that the questions that you can ask that would lead you to atheism, Augustine asks and is led to a life of faith. And I really mean that. I mean, as we get into these questions, you're going to notice that he asks the tough questions. He asks the question of theodicy. Why is it that evil exists in a world created by an all-powerful, all-loving deity? The same questions that, of course, Milton will be addressing in his Paradise Lost a few, of course, years later. The question now for St. Augustine in Book 1 is, where is God? And literally, not metaphorically, later he will come to Plato and the Platonists to help him. And of course, the other question is, how do you talk about God when God is something that we will later call translinguistic, beyond language? We'll get to, for example, a mystical statement that is shared between St. Augustine and Monica, his mother, later in the text. This is going to be a text about sin, mentioned already as well. Augustine will share his sins, but he will do so not to say, look at me, how sinful a person I was, but rather to talk about the nature of addiction. That's huge, you want to write that one down. And the nature of what it means to admit, or as it's called, confess one's sins. And in the confession process, we will see this text then as a propedeutic. We've used that term before. Instructional, didactic, tending towards helping one to understand the very idea of looking back at one's life and trying to somehow recreate a sense of the stages of one's life. From here on out, anytime we pick up autobiography, and quite frankly, biography, we're constantly going to be reminded that it was St. Augustine who said later in his life, I think I want to look at my life as a series of stages. And I go through these stages, and in each one of these stages, I'm looking for something. Now, he says, I see, looking back, that what I was looking for was something called God. And somehow, rest or peace can only be found when I finally found God, right? Well, then, where's one to begin? Well, he begins, of course, in infancy, and he points out that babies are sinners. Now, this is a very controversial idea right off of the bat. Babies are sinners. Why? Because babies are sinners because they are always self-absorbed. They are completely narcissistic. Now, not in any intentional way. And you could argue that really in many ways, St. Augustine is really kind of seeing this as almost like more metaphoric. And yet, of course, as a Christian theologian, he will later have to defend the idea that infants themselves, if not properly baptized, will, if they die in their infancy, spend an eternity in hell. That's a very controversial idea we kind of will not deal too much with because in the Confessions it's not dealt with. But you can run down that kind of information and study on your own. The joy, the suffering, the power of learning language is the next thing that he talks about. He talks about being at school. He talks about how education for him was a challenge, right? By the way, let's go ahead and say, if we've already said, and we have in earlier lectures about Plato, especially in my lectures on Republic, not necessarily in the Harvard Classics, but at learnstrong.net, you can find my lectures on Republic.